Welcome to our Elevate Stage session, Increasing Racial and Ethnic Diversity on Museum Boards. We would like to thank Blackbaud for their generous support of this Elevate Stage session. Before we begin, here's another moment of joy.
Dear AAM colleagues, you know what gives me joy? First and foremost, you. The fact that the museum community, all of you, have been courageous, innovative, tenacious, and inspiring.
You have changed, you've become nimble, you've made sure that first and foremost, we serve the public, we make the public better, we give the public reality and hope. So one, the joy comes from looking at the work you've done. I'm also taking great joy from candidly watching my granddaughter and grandson laugh uncontrollably on Zoom at little jokes I tell them. That to me is so special. And I take great glee from recognizing that most days I do not have to wear a tie. So they give me joy. But most importantly, I get joy from all of you. Thank you for what you've done. You make us all better.
And Patrick Salazar, Executive Director of Latinos Lead. I'm Arthur Affleck, Executive Vice President of AAM. I'm excited to moderate this conversation between my colleagues in advancing racial and ethnic diversity on museum boards. As the decision-making body at the highest level of the organization, boards play a critical role in creating an organization that prioritizes, supports, and invests in diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion, DEAI. According to research sponsored by AAM and BoardSource in 2017 and issued in the Museum Board Leadership Report, 46% of museum boards were 100% white, and only 10% had a plan to do anything about it. On a positive note, the report also showed that 77% of museum directors viewed DEAI as important to their missions. Through its Facing Change Museum Board Diversity Initiative, the Alliance has worked with over 50 museums in 5 states. And in 2 years, we have helped place 100 diverse trustees or trustees of color on participating museum boards. But the work has just begun, and so much more needs to be done. So today, we want to continue this conversation about increasing racial and ethnic diversity on museum boards. To begin, I invite this distinguished panel to give a brief overview of your work and how it relates to advancing diversity and inclusion on museum boards and other boards. So let's start with Jean, and then Brooke, and then Victoria, and then Patrick. Jean.
Thanks for having me, Arthur. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I can tell you that as President and CEO, I'm presenting as a work in progress, both as an individual and as an organization. We're moving from having a long-stated goal to build a more diverse board to long-term work that's guided by learning and reflection and actual action planning. So that's been a real fundamental difference. Words to action.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Arthur, for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon with such a great group. I'm Brooke Minto, Executive Director for the Black Trustee Alliance for Art Museums. I'm, barely a month in the role, and so new to this startup initiative, which certainly Victoria will share quite a bit about in its nascent year in just a moment. But by way of background, I've had the pleasure of working and serving in museums for 20 years. I'm a New Yorker originally and have worked in institutions from New York to Miami, New Orleans, and even abroad in Cape Town, institutions of varying sizes, serving cities and communities of equally varying size. And so it's a real pleasure to bring all of my experience from those communities to the Black Trustee Alliance and to help trustees, from across the country and certainly all of the North American institutions that we serve, think about diversity in their institution and on their own boards. Thanks again for having me.
Victoria.
Hi, I'm delighted to be here. As Brooke mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders of the Black Trustee Alliance for Art Museums, an initiative that really came to be in 2020. I do that work as well as sitting on the board of the Brooklyn Museum and Creative Time, nonprofits based in New York. I'm sure many of you know of them. And then also relevant experience for this panel is that at the Brooklyn Museum, I co-chair the Board Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Access Committee.
Great. Mr. Salazar.
Thank you, Arthur, and thanks for allowing me to join this esteemed panel. I am not a museum expert. I am the founder and executive director of Latinos for Leadership, Excellence, and Diversity. We have a very simple mission, and that is to prepare and recruit Latino professionals for service on nonprofit boards of directors. We do this in several ways. We have governance seminars for Latinos interested in serving. We have recruiting services, both free online as well as a much more highly focused and customized executive search service for board members. And we have a program called Lead with Intent, where we work with nonprofit boards, governing boards, to help position them to successfully recruit and retain Latino board members. You can find us at latinosleadnow.org. As I mentioned in my opening, I am not a museum expert, but I'm very fortunate to be in Los Angeles, where we have just a wonderful pool of arts and cultural experts. Our lead advisor on this is Susana Bautista. Some of you may know from her service at AAM, and she's just been a real resource for us in helping work with the sector in a productive way.
Thank you, Patrick. Of course, we know Susana well. Why don't we stick with you, Patrick, for the first question? Why is the issue of placing more trustees of color on museum boards important, and why now?
It's really a question of relevance. Museums, like so many other not-for-profits, rely to a large extent on the proceeds that they generate from people coming to the museum, going to the bookstore, being part of the education programs. And when we look at the audiences, certainly in Los Angeles and throughout California, and in many other major urban areas of our country, who is the audience in 2050? And I think boards of, governing boards, by nature, one of their primary roles is strategic planning. And you cannot put together a responsible strategic plan for a museum today without looking at your audience 2-3 decades out. And in this part of the country and many others, that audience is necessarily significant segments of, we say people of color, I just ethnic and racial minorities. So stay relevant, keep up with your audience. And primarily, I think it's one of honoring your status as a nonprofit organization. If you are registered as a 501c3, you are a public benefit organization by definition. Who's your public and how are you benefiting them? And why now? I think we can see examples of what happens when we don't take steps when we don't have informed voices helping us make decisions. Recently, we saw some very unfortunate situations at Newfields and other museums where the voices involved in critical decisions and public-facing documents seem to be missing, and it can have significant consequences. To me, when I think of why now, and we chatted briefly before we started the session, Arthur, and I think some of the wonderful voices and opinions I heard lead me to a view that I share with nonprofit CEOs and board chairs in our work every day. We know that it took decades to get to a situation shown on your pie charts. 47%, 46% of all white boards. It's going to take a while to get to where we have boards that reflect the public that we are benefiting. We must start now. If not now, when?
Thank you. So is it a moral imperative, or is it about the business case as the corporate friends often talk about? Anyone? Is it Brooke?
Before we jump in there, I just want to add to Patrick's point. As much as it will take time, and I know this is a process. I read recently to your point about Newfields that they have appointed a board chair who is a woman of color, and so while I know this is a process, there are these examples now and again where some immediate action is taken by some institutions that I think do make us at least hopeful that there's some easy wins. So I think I read that within the last 3 or 4 days.
It's just too bad that it took that situation to maybe prompt it. Let's,
No, I appreciate it. I was just happy to see that there was a
absolutely
fix.
Absolutely.
But sorry, Arthur, go ahead.
No,
You had
anyone, and Brooke, you can take this if you want. Is this a moral imperative to have more board members of color, or is it about the business case, or both?
Well, I definitely say it's both, and that the two have to go hand in hand. But certainly, I welcome my colleagues who have been thinking about it as they lead institutions.
Yeah, I think it's both. If we don't do this work, we're not going to have a very good business. We're not going to be running businesses that are relevant. We're not going to be capturing the audience attention and support that we need. And I think our audiences are ahead of us. They're changing faster than we are. So I think it's important to keep that balanced perspective in mind. You have to do both things. Have the business and the moral imperatives.
Victoria, one of the concerns that we have heard is, the give-get policy on some museum boards is a deterrent or a challenge to having more members of color. Is the give-get policy a problem, and what can be done about it?
Sure. I think we all know that people of color have not had the opportunity to accumulate wealth in the same way that others have in our country. And, I, speaking from a Black perspective, just know that our community, while the gap is not improving as much as we would like to see over time, there are more people of color who are accumulating significant wealth. At the same time, there is a real divide. And so I think when it comes to the give-get policy, to really do this work well, I think that some flexibility there will probably get organizations further. A couple of tactics that I've seen employed are finding individuals who've been a part of boards in the past and care about an organization, but maybe don't have the time, though they do have the wealth to give. They don't have the time to be in a boardroom. And so having them donate their seats to somebody who is diverse in some ways, I think can be a really powerful way of bringing in diverse voices in the room and also having financial support behind them. Also, companies have been doing this too. I think those are really strong ways of bringing in more diverse voices. And then I also think, though, if there are ways to meet someone where they are and to have a frank conversation as a development person and say, what can you give? What would be a stretch for you? You can invite someone in and then grow with them. If you believe that over time they'll be able to give more, and they believe in your organization and you've given them a chance early on to get involved. I think that's the beginning of a really strong relationship that you can count on over time. And obviously you want those people to bring value in terms of their care for the organization or knowledge of the field that you're in.
Excellent.
Arthur, I also want to add to that. I think it's really important to recognize there's different types of contributions that trustees make to an organization. Some are financial, and those are important. And many are not financial, right? They are also important. And this is something that, we're working on in terms of language to be able to articulate that. And we're not there yet, but we're trying to figure out how you communicate the value of those non-financial contributions and really ask people to give it their capacity. Great suggestion from Victoria there. And to help us in these other ways that build relationships and build community.
And because isn't it the case that there are board members who write a check but are not at all really actively engaged in governance and of the organization, but others who may not give as much, but who contribute mightily to the organization? Is that not something we should consider? Anyone?
Well, absolutely. And I need to say, in our work with arts and cultural folks in particular, board membership has long been seen as cultural capital, right? These are seats of prestige, and I, in any one day, I will hear views ranging from those that Victoria mentioned, sponsored seats, if you will. I think sometimes that sets up a dynamic, almost like somebody saying, "Oh, well, that's an affirmative action appointment," or others, and I'll hear that from board chairs. But what I'm hearing more and more in the arts sector is one of, you know what? Stop. This model is dysfunctional. Just because you have money to give does not make you able to be on an effective member of a governing board, and to almost separate the roles. I've read a lot of research lately that where folks are advocating for maybe a trustee group made up of major donors, but a governance group that's made up of experts, leaders, thinkers, community informants. This is the number one issue that's raised whenever we're working with boards and looking at Latino candidates. I think the assumption, now we're lucky here in California that African American and Latino folks have made significant strides in terms of economic and community development. That said, I really do think that the entire model needs to be examined closely, Arthur, for relevance and in terms of leadership. I think we get into trouble when we have our boards dominated by folks with money who, as folks will acknowledge, don't always have the time or interest in governance.
Okay. I want to ask a question from the chat, and I want to invite.
Can I say one last thing on that point, Arthur?
Sure.
Which is just that I think institutions also have the ability to help create wealth in diverse communities. So institutions are often spending money with financial advisors, lawyers, vendors who are providing food within a museum space. And each of those moments where money is being spent, I think, is an opportunity to help. It's a long game, but to help create wealth in diverse communities that maybe over time would lead people who you've believed in that early moment to actually join in and be a part of board leadership in an organization.
Thank you.
Well, and if I could just put a coda on it, and I will be brief, Arthur. For decades, African Americans, Latinos, and others have been paying taxes. Taxes that in a significant level subsidize our nonprofit industry. Museums do not pay taxes on the earnings of their endowments, do not pay taxes on surplus revenue generated. Donations of art and major gifts of cash are tax deductible. Who makes up for that? Well, I'll tell you who makes up for that. The taxpayers in that community. In many ways, the people in a museum's community are the largest and most consistent major donors that they've ever had. It's just that we don't make it onto their annual reports or their list of gold or platinum circles.
So thank you. I want to ask a couple of questions from the chat. First, how do museums make themselves relevant and salient to communities of color in such a way that they are willing to support financially? Anyone?
Well, I think it, is tied to the program. I think, museums, it's incumbent on museums to ensure that their program, their collections, all of the content that they're producing reflects their community. And to some extent that seems obvious at this point, but I don't know that institutions are pursuing that work as earnestly as they should be and as consistently as they should be. I think if communities saw that institutions were prioritizing this, year over year, it would break a lot of barriers and create a much more kind of ease of access. It would just be natural that if, your culture or artists that are relevant to you, whatever the case may be, are reflected in that institution and as activities, that it would become an extension of your social life and the cultural life of you and your family.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. How do you encourage historically white-dominated boards to be ready to welcome BIPOC board members? How do you do that? Anyone?
So one of the big lessons learned for me over the last couple of years has been get some help, right? And we at the Chicago Botanic Garden have been really lucky to have been a part of the Facing Change program, which we began in the fall of 2019. And again, we were a place that had a goal of diversifying board membership, but we didn't have an action plan. And so the help we got through that program was really vital. And the other part of the help also came from the board itself. So the recognition that I had was that I needed a board champion, a person of standing who'd been around a while, who really embraced the work, understood its importance, and could bring other people along. So building that constituency of support and having them champion the work was really, really key. I think the third thing I would add there is the recognition that this is work. It's not just words, it's work, that it's ongoing, that it's long-term, was really, really key for us. So I think that get some help is the primary piece of advice I would have to folks.
Any others? Victoria, you were going to jump in?
Basically, exactly the same, where there is a robust industry around this work. And if you have the resources, finding experts who can help develop an action plan for your institution in particular, I think is invaluable. I also think a willingness to realize that as this is work, as Jean said, other work might need to take a back seat for a moment, and really being cognizant of the fact that this will take time to do, and allowing for that time, making room for that time is really important. So it's not just added on top of the incredibly busy, the busyness and sort of overworkedness that people are already feeling. I think carving out dedicated time goes a long way to making people feel like they can prioritize this work.
Sure. One other thing I wanted to raise,
Arthur, can I just tack a quick point onto that?
Sure.
When you said what's a recommendation, you really need to start from a position of knowledge. You need to gather data. It's remarkable how many nonprofits we work with. They don't know the ethnic makeup of their volunteer corps. They don't know the ethnic makeup of their customers. They don't know the ethnic makeup of their education programs. And you cannot make progress unless you are willing to state specific objectives in your leadership team, on your board, in where we get the best donors, we all know, from our volunteers and our docents, right? So if you are not collecting data about who your constituents are, then you will never know if you're making progress. And you certainly will not know how well you're serving the folks that make up your public. So for me, a lot of it is gain some awareness, gain some knowledge, do some homework.
Sure. Another question in the chat. We are a small institution in a region that is nearly 90% Caucasian. Ethnic diversity is challenging, but we do look at age, socioeconomic, and gender and diversity on our board. Are there other ways we can still increase racial and ethnic diversity on the board, given the realities of our geography? Anyone?
Something I think about with regard to small cities or regional institutions is to think nationally about board participation. If there are folks from that community who have gone out and moved elsewhere in the country, and who might still have a vested interest in the success of cultural institutions in their hometown, so to speak, they still have family there. If it might just give them some sense of pride to be involved with their hometown institution, the city they grew up in, so to speak. I think that there's a real possibility there. I do think that in a way, that's something that institutions don't think enough about, those who have gone away from their community, especially in smaller communities.
I think that's an excellent point. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, but I'm on a board in New York, my home in Brooklyn, and my home city. And I do because
I'm tethered to the community. And for a lot of people, it's where you grew up, it's where you were educated, it's what formed you as a professional. And I think that's not something that's tapped into quite enough.
Right. Yep. Any other responses to that question?
I would study the population trends. Just because it's 90% white now doesn't mean it will be in 2040. Mm-hmm. And how do you prepare for that? And what is your audience reach? So you have wonderful museums in northern Nevada or in central Nebraska, and yet so many of their visitors are where? From out of town. Mm-hmm. And so what can your board do in terms of reflecting, again, who's coming through the doors? Who do you want to come through the doors?
So one other item I want to bring up, I have worked in development advancement for a number of years, and increasingly when applying for a grant, foundations are asking questions about the organization's DEAI makeup. Have you all experienced that, and is that another incentive to take seriously how your organization is approaching and advancing diversity and inclusion? Anyone?
Absolutely. It was before we began this work with Facing Change, that was one of the things that I was consistently reporting to my board, was that this audience, the funding audience in the form of foundations particularly, wanted to see data, plans, and progress. So really helpful to somebody like me trying to build a case and put pressure on a board for change. So that's been really instrumental.
I think 2 quick points from me on data collection, Arthur, and you and I discussed it last week. One is what we hear a lot from boards are, people are awkward. Our volunteers don't want to give that information. My response is don't make that assumption. And 2 is, so these are the same people who have their personal lives all over social media that are worried about privacy. So I think people are a lot more willing to share data now than they used to be. And one of the things that I would say, here in California, they've passed laws in the last several years requiring more women and people of color on private sector boards, publicly traded corporations. I can assure you that there is thinking along those same lines regarding our sector. And I would encourage nonprofit boards, get ahead of it. Don't wait until the state, a state law is going to require it. I think New York City Arts Commission, you mentioned you're on a board in Brooklyn. Is it not true that the New York City Arts Commission requires diversity on arts boards to even apply for a grant? Or it's a significant criteria, I believe, in grants decisions. So get ahead of it.
Makes sense. So another question, and I'll direct this to Victoria and or Brooke. In your experience, what should museum leaders do to support trustees of color once you get them? How do you then support them so you can keep them?
Sure. I think first, have more than one. Nobody wants to be tokenized.
Say that again.
So I think that's the first step. I also think that board leadership in cultural institutions is often different from board leadership in other organizations or for-profit institutions. So not taking for granted that everything is understood and having the patience to really share like how this, not just how cultural institutions boards work, but how this particular museum's board works and where the orbits of power are, and share how you want them specifically to be involved and what impact you think they can make, and then really empowering them to try to make that impact. I also think that, at least for me, it's been really valuable to have time to connect outside of the boardroom. I think it's hard to try to make change happen when there aren't friendships or trust that has been built with the other people in the room. And so I think providing opportunities to develop that sense of community and really friendship makes it easier to challenge people in the boardroom and open up discussions that might be difficult. I think, those are my main ideas.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think that is a role that is important that BTA will play. To Victoria's point about community beyond the board, a number of early BTA members have expressed this interest and this desire to have a community beyond the one or two board members they might see on their own board, but to share learnings and to share ideas, to hear what's worked at other institutions so that they might, advocate for change in their own appointment. So I think that's something we're hearing more and more from Black trustees especially, and that we hope BTA can provide that community for the sharing of information, but also just for support in this work.
Great. So that's what they should do. What should they not do? Patrick and you and I had a conversation about some of the things that they should not do to board members of color once you get them. You want to share some of that?
So no, in terms of retention, it's pretty clear. Once you have folks on your board, don't assume that they're going to speak for the entire community that they happen to share an identity with. If someone looks at you and says, "So Arthur, what do African Americans think about this and that?" and you're going, why don't you ask them? Because I can speak for myself, but if you would, if you're serious about it, developing an institutional kind of understanding, well, there are a lot of ways to gather that information. Your own research, maybe you do your own primary research, do some focus groups, some marketing, some outreach. But I'd like to recommend one thing, what not to do in terms of recruiting too, Arthur, and that is don't assume that your organization holds the same cachet that it might have with its traditional board nominees. It might not be that big of a deal to folks. So what I see a lot of not-profit organizations do, for example, they don't list the board bios on their website. Any board candidate that's serious is going to do their homework, and they want to see what cohort they're being asked to join. They want access to financials. And also, and this goes back to data, a lot of folks are very interested in what work you're doing now with the community. So if you go on a museum's website and they say, well, we have all these wonderful K-12 programs. Well, a lot of board candidates might want to know exactly what schools or districts you're working with and what proportions of those students are Latino. Do you have internships? So I really do think it's one of marketing. There are, for Latino and African American and other professionals of color, there's a pretty tight market. They're in demand and they have choices to make. And it is absolutely critical not to assume that they're going to be all excited and wanting to serve on your board. You're asking them to give time, treasure, expertise. Why should they? Flip the argument around.
Excellent. Go ahead.
thought,
Go ahead, please.
just one other thought on this is that, people of color are not the only people who can work on or care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I think sometimes a thing that's lost is that as we're trying to find board members who are racially and ethnically diverse, why not also try to find, when you're inevitably bringing on people who are not racially and ethnically diverse, people who are maybe white but have shown that they care about diversity, equity, and inclusion and have a track record of, in their own careers, supporting progressive ideas around these issues.
Oh, excellent, excellent. So people hearing this conversation, a lot of museums have engaged in this process. Some have not yet dipped their toes in the water for whatever reason. We're going through the pandemic, people have been busy. But Jean, for museums trying to get started, I need to do something about DEAI. I want to get started. I'm the CEO. What do I do?
So I said it earlier in response to a different question, but it's a similar position. Get some help, right? Get some help. Identify the allies among your board as it exists today who recognize both the moral and the business imperative. And I think that really importantly, as you do that, don't just collect data on the programs you offer and the audiences you serve, but begin to collect data on yourself so that you understand where you're at in terms of what is inevitably a developmental journey. So really kind of begin to understand the position and the space which the board itself occupies, because it takes that perspective and that understanding to help people realize that you are involved in real work here, that you're not just involved in talking about it. But I can't emphasize that enough. You've got to get help in a variety of different forms.
Anyone else? Okay, I'll go to you.
Well, I think to Jean's point, and this is just simply to plug the Black Trustee Alliance once more, for those institutions that do have Black board members serving, the Black Trustee Alliance certainly is a partner to not only those trustees, but to its directors. And so, pointing them in the direction of the Alliance for its educational programming and all of what it offers, it's an opportunity to not only identify your allies on the board for the directors out there, but also to help them get more educated and just sort of work on their own skill sets. And it will help them lead in committee and lead at the board level with more confidence and certainly with more effectiveness. I think that's part of it. Not just identify your allies, but also make sure that they're doing the developmental work that they need to help you reach your goals as an institution.
I would have two quick recommendations. One is be willing to maybe allow your board dynamic, your group dynamic, your group culture to shift a little bit. I realize, especially with legacy boards, they arrive at a comfort level. And that comfort level is something that sometimes they don't necessarily want to let go of. I get that. But with any new board members bringing in perspectives that maybe they have not shared before, be prepared for a little bit of adjustment. And the second thing, and this I would emphasize as strongly as possible, avoid usual suspects. In a lot of communities, you'll have some prominent Latinos or African Americans who serve on 6 boards. Enough already. Reach beyond the names that everybody knows. It's tempting, I know, to go after the executive VP of the PepsiCo distributor. I get it. And we all know, maybe we have found a few folks who are reasonably cooperative and don't rock the boat. But you know what, they're spread thin. And what you're not doing is developing talent. And so I would certainly, avoid the usual suspects. It's a recycle rut that many, especially mid-sized communities, find themselves in. It's the same people over and over.
Arthur, can I add to this as well?
Please.
I think the other really important thing that we are learning and that I think is important for others to think about as they begin doing this work is avoid this assumption that your community or board culture is a static state. It's not, and we're talking about changing it. And if you think about it as a particular culture that is fixed, that to which others have to adapt, we're going to fail, right? We are talking about building new community. So we've got to help our boards do that. Recognizing that this is about a process of change is really, really important.
All right, a couple of questions from the chat. One is, are there good examples of organizations that have effectively separated governance and trustees? I'm curious how that balance of power might work effectively. And I think, Patrick, you suggested that as an approach.
I did, and yet here I'm going to defer to my colleagues and experts in the field. I can point to some in health and human services. For example, community health centers have done a great job. Now they're required by federal law, which provides a fair amount of their funding, to have a board that's 51% or more of patients, service recipients. And so that's their governing board. Okay. But they will often have a separate fundraising team that is made up of trustees, or even establish an independent foundation. You will see this a lot of times with K-12 at charter schools and others. So I don't know as much in the arts and culture field, so I'd be interested to hear from some of the other panelists.
I think there's some international examples of this, where you've had long-standing, very large percentage of budgets coming from central government, and to get into fundraising, which is a new thing, you create a separate foundation. But I would argue that eventually, in time, the same questions about diversity within those foundation boards will arise. So I think that's the one question I'd have about looking at this separation as a solution. I think that it's a little more complicated than that.
Another question from the chat. How do you encourage diverse members of Latinx communities and Black communities to participate on boards? Some treat Latinidad and Blackness as monoliths. How do you prevent that? Anyone? I mean, you spoke to this a little bit earlier, I think, Patrick, about, assuming things.
I mean, take a look at the 2020 elections. The Latino diaspora in the U.S. ranges from folks in South Florida to, people in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, to L.A. and other areas that reflect so many different cultural and other perspectives, whether it's New Yorican, whether it's Chicano down here, whether in LA. I think what you need to do is, somebody mentioned it earlier, meet people where they are. It's very important in your own community and again, this is where we get the data, right? Understand who you're working with locally and who are your visitors. You may have a fairly, strong international or other visitor group from different areas. Bottom line is, I hope that a lot of people in museum management are beginning to get that you can't make assumptions. Now, I'm again speaking solely for the Latino, community, in terms of the Latino community makeup. You simply can't make assumptions, even in your outreach. A lot of times, people will make an assumption that they're just translate directly your marketing materials. Well, that may not work with your, Central American communities, right? El Salvador, here in LA, we have very strong El Salvadoran and other Central American, Honduran, and other communities. Doesn't always work. So just, I think, build some awareness, do some homework, and understand that just because they're brown, it doesn't mean they're going to think the same way.
Here's an interesting question in the chat. How do we compensate BIPOC board members for the emotional labor that they are likely expected to contribute as museums work on DEAI? They are often recruited and then expected to carry the organization into equity, which can be incredibly taxing and even traumatizing. Anyone? Anyone, Victoria?
No, I wish that I had an answer to that question. I defer.
Okay, Brooke, anything, anyone?
No, I think I was just going to say something kind of cute.
Yeah, please.
No. It was really just, just deep gratitude. It's hard work, but yeah, I don't know that there's a serious answer.
I think the other part of the answer is it's everybody's work, right?
Yeah, it's everything.
And Patrick, you mentioned it. Don't ask your board members of color to do all this heavy lifting. Everybody else has their work cut out for them.
Yeah. I had a wonderful call with, I had a wonderful conversation a few months ago with a South Asian consultant who works with boards, and her response to me, and sometimes there's a weariness. It's exhausting, right? It's not our job to cure you of your issues, right? You're a grown-up. See a therapist. And it's not. It's a lot of organizations like ours. We have a very strong African American Board Leadership Institute right here in LA. They're a beautiful group. In fact, they were very instrumental in helping us develop our early strategy. And one of the things that was shared with us right up front was, we are not a DEI consultant. We're not here to cure you of your racism. That's your job. We're here to help you find diverse board members. Work, be grown-ups, work together toward a common mission. And some of these biases will begin to be less prominent. As one thing the research does show, Arthur, and I think I shared with you some of this last week, was when groups of disparate folks work together toward a common mission, they tend to make these assumptions. These assumptions tend to take on a less of importance, right? Whether it's an immigrant, whether it's somebody from a different culture, a different city, as we work together, whether it's in student groups, workforce, a task force at your workplace, or as community members, those negative biases tend to be lessened as we learn to work with each other. So honestly, that's where we're coming from.
Another question from the chat. I feel like these conversations we've been having for a long time. What are some examples / case studies that you can provide for ways that you have actively increased board diversity? So I can jump in here and say that, we have in our Facing Change program examples of museums that we began with administering the IDI inventory, doing training with their boards, helping them to actually develop a plan, and then identifying candidates, presenting those candidates to them, and the museums themselves selecting appropriate candidates for their board. So we will have case studies on our site that will reflect the progress and success that we've had. Other case studies or examples that others can share. Anyone? So they're out there. We'll increasingly have more on our website. There was another question in the chat, and this is for Brooke. Does the Black Trustee Alliance for Art Museums actually exist? Is it a real thing? Would you like to answer that?
Yes, it does. It's a startup. It's certainly in its pilot phase. It was founded by Victoria and a 12-person steering committee last August. I joined the Black Trustee Alliance as executive director less than 4 weeks ago. But we do exist. We have about 130 members at this point, and happy to share for our members, we'll have a first convening, which will become an annual affair in mid-June. So we do exist, we're up and running, and by this fall, by September, we'll be commissioning the first of what will be several annual studies that we will do as a group so that we can measure a lot of this data that we've been talking about year over year to really understand, how many Black trustees are currently serving in art museums and what their contributions are. What committees are they serving on? What are they giving in cash, in art? How are they giving in terms of time or other services to their institutions? So, at the board level, we do want to create these studies and complement those that have been done by AAM, AMD, by the Mellon Foundation, by others, and really, look at a full picture of how Black people are involved in museums at the board level, the staff level, at the programmatic level. We really want to complement the surveys that are already out there and make sure that they're repeated year over year.
Great.
So it's up and running. Yeah, go ahead, Victoria.
Well, I was just going to jump in and add that maybe it's connected to the last question too, in that I think what we learned is that we actually didn't all know each other, and that a first step was understanding what was already happening before really doubling down on recruiting more people to join our ranks. So of course, we'd love to have more Black trustees of art museums, across North America. I think our first stage was really about learning about what's actually happening already. How could we wrap our arms around that and empower Black trustees who are already a part of organizations to feel like they could be their most successful version of themselves?
Yeah, and I'll just say too, I'll tell you what, these efforts take a lot of work and a lot of commitment by people who are not paid in the early stages of that work. Arthur, you and I had breakfast out here 2 or 3 years ago. And even at that time, we were incorporated in early 2017. It took 2 years for us to get a grant.
Wow.
We are only now doing our first recruiting contracts and our first board development contracts during the pandemic. Thankfully, far-sighted philanthropies like Ford Foundation and like the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and some others out this way, Amundsen, Weingart, and others, have been extremely helpful in getting it. But this and you know what? There's not a huge network of organizations that have capacity or that have experience in this work. And so congratulations, Victoria and Brooke. This is hard work, and it's often done in addition to what you're doing for a living. So way to go, folks.
Thank you, Patrick. I should acknowledge that certainly BTA is one of those initiatives that is fortunate enough to have the support of the Ford Foundation in its nascent year. And so it's through their support that the steering committee has been able to plan for this 3-year pilot, and that we'll be able to do this work, with their funding as we attract members and hopefully more support in the years to come.
Thank you. One other question from the chat, and then I want each of you to have a chance to make some closing comments before we run out of the time. So how can someone that's not in a director, president, CEO role help to advocate for more diversity on the board? Jean, you want to take that? If you're not in your role, can a staff member, what advice do you give to those who are not in the leadership role? How can they advocate for diversity on their board if they're a junior level staff?
Yeah. So just like I said that I think our audiences are ahead of us organizationally, I think our staff are ahead of us as well. And there are some fantastic voices at staff level who, in simply raising the question, are having a fantastic impact. And I also think that COVID has been horrible in a lot of ways. But among the silver linings is that in using these different ways of communicating, I think there has been almost a democratization of voices' ability to rise. So it isn't just the person that manages to be in the room, because messages can come in a variety of different ways. So I would say it's a matter of listening, developing that listening muscle for staff, because they're talking about this stuff and they're running pretty quickly with it.
So why don't we go with the closing comments? And Jean, I mentioned I'd go in the same order as before: Jean, Brooke, Victoria, and then Patrick. So any closing thoughts that you have that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I've reflected a lot on this. I think, importantly, this is work, right? The work of building strong, inclusive, diverse boards, it's a lifetime of work. It's not one and done. I'll tell you that when we first started Facing Change, there was a numeric goal to add 2 new board members of color by the end of the program. Well, we met that within the first couple of months of the program, but it wasn't enough because we had to focus on building our effectiveness as a increasingly diverse board and organization. And the other thing I would add and remind myself of and all of us is that any long-term project, there's fits and starts, right? So when we get stuck, when we feel like we've plateaued, when we feel like we're failing, we've got to take a step back, reflect, review, relearn, and begin again. Begin again and again and again, because the learning is continuous. And it's really about, embracing that this is a journey of change, that we are not static state individuals or organizations. So let's get comfortable with beginning again, because it's going to be with us and be with us and be with us.
Brooke?
Yeah, so I think in thinking about the next several months with BTA, building our community is a top priority. And so for those directors who are on the line, and if there are museum trustees on the line, I would encourage them to visit the blacktrusteealliance.org and to submit their information to be in touch with us. We very much want to create a collective that can reach out to us for resources, for sharing, for all kinds of educational programming. But we need to know who's out there, to really have a sense of, all the Black trustees who are currently serving around the country, and certainly all over North America. So I'd encourage directors to share the Black Trustee Alliance with their trustees, new resource, and from there we would love to engage those trustees in all of the research that we'll be doing in the months to come. But certainly to think about it as a resource that can be tapped in the work that you're doing, and for supplemental information and for support through the process.
Thank you, Brooke. Victoria?
Yes, please join us at the Black Trustee Alliance. We are so excited to be up and running, to have Brooke at the helm. We have two members of staff now, which is a big deal, and I think means that our impact can grow exponentially. But as Brooke mentioned, we would love to know who's out there and to have you join us. I think the openness of conversation here today was really inspiring to me too, and gives me hope. As Jean said, we all are in a development and learning process. And I think being in community with one another, learning from one another, asking each other questions is just so incredibly important. So I'm just grateful to those of you who showed up to be a part of this conversation today and be a part of the chat and answering us questions. And I hope the conversation can continue.
Thank you. Patrick?
Thank you, Arthur. And just thrilled to hear some of the views of fellow panelists here. And Victoria and Brooke, we're more than happy to do anything we can to work with you or share some of our early experiences with you. So quickly, just take action. Just stop talking about it. Take action. We all saw these beautiful statements up on people's websites after George Floyd, and all of this statement of solidarity, and that's great as a starting point, as a conceptual and spiritual starting point. Beautiful. Now move to action. And what's going to see outcomes? Marketing. How do African Americans and Latino folks and others see you? And be transparent about it. Be real about it. Ask hard questions. How are you viewed by the communities you're trying to engage? And finally, I would just say budget. Put some money where your intentions are. It costs money. A focus group, a consultant, a contract with Latinos Lead or whomever, latinosleadnow.org. Thank you very much. Get serious about it. Put some money behind it and some homework. It's okay. We're all starting this together. We're all beginning this work together. And there will be stumbles. And I really appreciate that point. Let's keep moving. It's going to be okay. We have to do it. We do it together.
Well, I want to take this moment to thank you all. You all mentioned some of your supporters earlier, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say our Facing Change program is handsomely supported by the Ford Foundation and the Mellon Foundation and the Alice Walton Foundation. But thank you, Jean, Brooke, Victoria, and Patrick for this illuminating session on advancing racial and ethnic diversity at the leadership level. This concludes day one of our 2021 annual meeting at MusuemExpo. We thank everyone in the audience for joining us for today. Please be sure to return on June 7th at 9 a.m. Central Time for continued sessions and networking, events and engagement, and more. And we will continue this conversation offline. But thank you, everyone, for your participation. Have a great day, and we'll see you soon.
Good work, Arthur.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Arthur. Bye-bye.
Bye.